What is going on, OWS fam, DFS fam? Welcome to our first edition of the Week 2 DFS Labs Draftkings. Keegan will be on here in just a moment. We will be building a roster, talking through some of our thoughts on this slate. So with that, let's go ahead and get started.
1 week season.
There we go. We're getting our feet under us with JM, the director. You see my eyes like move to the side to try to find where to push the button to play the music. I did. So I don't know if you've watched this show that I do on Fridays with Squirrel Patrol from Roto Grinders, but Squirrel Patrol is like one of the sharpest DFS players ever. And he's great on air because his thoughts are really well organized and he lays them out in a way that makes sense to people listening. But he's not, we were talking about this, we were talking about this before the show last week. He's not like an online personality. Like he's very just like straight line, but then they put all this like production stuff on his plate for that show. So he's always like looking around. And this last week he had to do an ad read for Ticketmaster. We have a lot of fun with that. But yeah, with that out of the way, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Got a haircut.
Got a haircut. It looks really good.
A lot better than the mop,
We were talking before the show. You said it might be your first haircut since January. So yeah, welcome to dad life. That's the way things are. Yeah, I Abby and the kids got home last night and they went to bed at 11 and Goldie was up at 6 a.m. William was up at 7. And by the time Abby came down at like 9:30, it looked like a bomb had gone off in the house. It was just like first day back with all of their toys and everything is in the living room. So,
anyway.
Yeah. How was your week 1? Did it go good, bad?
Probably pretty bad. I mean, like roster wise, I'm happy with how I build things, but I just think I did not expect a lot of those like first window games to be that low scoring. Yeah, I guess more in the beginning they were very low scoring, like the first half for sure.
Yeah, I mean, kind of everything was low scoring outside of Chargers and Dolphins, and as we kind of anticipated, there weren't a lot of ways to take advantage of that. Obviously, Tua was a really nice piece, and Tyreek you had to have. Eckler performed at the same level as Christian McCaffrey, so you could have gone like a different direction there. But everybody else, all the other popular pieces from that game, disappointed. Yeah, I had a weird week where it was a great week of play. I like Sunday morning, Abby and the kids were still out of town. So I had some time to really assess things and be like, am I 1-0 so far in terms of play? Is this a profitable week if we could play this slate 100 times? Felt really great about the play and then had a profitable weekend. But I did make, I had a roster that finished second place in one tournament and seventh in another tournament that I really loved it and almost used it as my main lineup in high dollar single entry. And then it had Puka Nacua on it. And I was like, I can't pull the trigger in high dollar single entry. So I made a couple changes to that roster. And so it was like that roster would have won first place for 100K. And instead I finished like 29th place, which was like a nice payout, but it was a significant difference in money. So one of those weeks where they kind of like, you come out of it and you're like, oh, and it was, I took a nap Sunday afternoon and woke up and kind of checked and I was like, oh, nice. I'm in profit on everything. And then it was like 30 minutes later that I realized that my best roster in these other tournaments was the one that I thought about using in my main. And I mean, it was what I used in my main. I just made a couple changes to that roster. And so then I went from being like, oh, nice, profitable week 1 to being like, oh, could have been. So yeah, like Monday and Tuesday were like conscious work to put that behind me emotionally so that it doesn't affect me this next week, because it's like that happened and there will be other chances for big payouts. So, but I'll miss out on those if I'm kind of living in the past and worrying about that too much. So yeah, weird week 1 in that it was a good week 1, but like a hard week 1 coming out of it. So, but yeah, with that, you had a chance to dig into this slate much this week?
Yeah, I mean, I've given it a couple of looks. I haven't really dug in deep. I had, with yesterday with my job interview and everything. Yeah. So,
So, and for any of you who are newer to this show, that's kind of the concept of this show is, Keegan, when did you start playing DFS?
Either 2020 or 2021.
Okay. Probably more seriously in 2021, really paying attention. I started in 2013 and started taking it seriously in 2014. So kind of the vibe here is for Keegan to be a proxy for the audience who might be more casual players or newer players and be able to ask the questions that you guys might ask and be looking at things on rosters that you guys might be looking at. And for me to kind of chime in with, again, I do this full time and know all the teams and players really well. And that's part of my job to do that. And I've been playing DFS at a successful rate for a long time. And so be able to kind of bounce back my thoughts from that perspective. So yeah, with that, I guess we might as well go ahead and open up this roster build. Interesting week. So I broke this down in the Angles email. If you're not an OWS member, the Angles email is free every week. You just sign up for OWS free. You also get free game breakdowns every week and some other cool things. But the Angles email, we take a top-down view of the slate. And one of the things, like the thing that stood out to me this week, obviously we have Kansas City and Jacksonville, which is going to stand out. We have Seattle at Detroit, and that game was a 48-45 game last year. And I've added this context a couple times. Last year, when the Dolphins and Chargers played, Tua threw for 145 yards. The Dolphins scored 17 points, right? And then threw for over 400 yards this last week, and they scored 36 points. So what happened last year isn't predictive, but it is still instructive. We can look at this and be like, okay, Seattle and Detroit can certainly shoot out at a high level. And then we have some other spots that are almost equally interesting to me. Buffalo against Las Vegas. I think the Buffalo is going to want to have a statement win here where they just try to put up as many points as they can. Obviously, they might get in their own way, or Las Vegas might get in their way, but that's going to be their goal. Baltimore and Cincinnati is probably going to be competitive and low scoring, but it has potential to be high scoring. So we have to keep that one in mind. Tennessee last year faced the highest opponent pass play rate in the NFL. They're pretty much impossible to run on. And so we should expect the Chargers to be throwing the ball quite a bit this week, and that opens a lot of opportunities for upside. And then San Francisco, they've scored 30-plus points in 7 of their last 9 regular season games. And the Rams looked really good this last week. So the only weakness of the San Francisco defense is the pass defense. Obviously, the Rams will have to pass a lot. So there's a chance that game is more competitive than people would expect. And either way, San Francisco is going to score a lot of points. So yeah, there are some offenses with Buffalo, San Francisco, Jacksonville, Kansas City, the Chargers that, really some potential this week for points, kind of different from last week. So yeah, those are my sort of macro thoughts. I'll toss it over to you for anything you want to add to that before we start building.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of have the same look. I didn't really even look at the Vegas Buffalo game. I don't know what it was for me, but something's kind of thrown me off of Josh Allen. It could have been from last year, just some bias there, but I just haven't really been looking at him the same. Maybe since like halfway through last year. I was really on him a lot in the beginning, either like last year, the year before that, but kind of recently more, I've kind of like tilted my viewpoint.
Yeah, one of the things with Josh Allen is he's probably not going to get a 40-pointer. Like he's not going to be the guy you absolutely had to have in order to win. But we also know that 30-pointers are relatively rare on any given week. And so piling up, once we kind of crack that 30-point threshold, I worry less about salary multipliers. And 30 points would be about 4x for Josh Allen. And so it's just a great spot for, and I almost never play Stephon Diggs because now if we click on game logs, we just see 2023, which is one game. But if we look at last year's game logs, you'll see that with Stephon Diggs, always scoring like those 18 to 22, 25 points, a lot of 27-pointers, some 30-pointers, but he never goes for like those 40-pointers. So when you have a slate with like a Justin Jefferson on it, a Tyreek Hill on it, I want to go to those guys instead of Stephon Diggs because like if those guys get 40 and Diggs gets 29, that's still a huge gap, and you needed that other guy. But this week, Jamar Chase in a tough matchup. Amon-Ra St. Brown, very similar in that he rarely goes for more than like 25, 26 points. So Diggs, and anytime Diggs hits, Josh Allen hits. So I love that because you get like 1,600 in salary, basically, that you're getting correct all at once. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting spot, but I'm guessing that's not where we're going to start this build. So where do you want to start this particular build? Thinking about winning a tournament this week.
Places that I wouldn't mind starting, either the Seattle-Detroit game or the Chiefs-Jags game. Either or is okay with me.
Let's go ahead and talk about both those spots real quickly. And I'll just mention a couple interesting things on each. So Seattle, if we go through their game logs for like a decade, almost all their final scores are close games. And they're either close low-scoring games or close high-scoring games. And the way that they play on offense, just in Pete Carroll's system and his mentality and how he views being the best way to win games, the way they play on offense is very much dictated by what the opponent does. So for years, I've preached never play Seattle pass game pieces unless you expect the opponent to score points. Never play Seattle pass game pieces unless you're playing pieces from the other side, because they only have blow up games when they're forced to get aggressive by the other team scoring. So this game will obviously have to be driven by Detroit. And that's the way I'm looking at it, right? But Detroit can clearly score points against Seattle. So on this week, that's a less critical element to pay attention to than other weeks, because this week you probably would be playing Seattle pieces with Detroit pieces. But that's just a reminder to anybody watching or listening, is that when you play a Seattle pass game piece, you want to be playing a piece from the other side, because it has to be a game environment in which the other team is scoring points for these Seattle pieces to really pop off, or almost has to be. And so, I think that spot's very interesting. Obviously, I think Goff is interesting. I think Geno is interesting in terms of we've got these 8K quarterbacks who could put up 30 points, but also we have these much cheaper guys who could put up 25 to even 30 points, right? So I think that's interesting. And then the Kansas City Jacksonville game, it's a weird one, because we saw last week when Kelsey was out, they just spread the ball around. Like, so many guys got targets, so many guys got opportunities. And so it really is sort of obviously somebody could score multiple touchdowns and be a really valuable piece. But in terms of what we can predict in any way, it's like Kelsey and Mahomes, right? And then on the Jags side, there's 5 guys, and probably any given week, one of those 5 guys is going to have a score that you really wanted to have, among Zay Jones and Christian Kirk and Calvin Ridley and Evan Ingram and Travis Etienne, and maybe 2 of those guys. So that one's an interesting spot too, because it's like you look at this offense and you say, probably one of these 5 guys is going to be on tournament winning rosters this week, but you don't ever really know which of those 5 guys it'll be. So that's just kind of like that doesn't lead us to any answers necessarily, but that's sort of my macro view on both of these spots. So if we start with kind of anchoring things with a quarterback with a passing attack, I don't think there's a wrong answer here. Just kind of any of these 4 we go with kind of determines what we do next on our roster. So with that, which one do you want to start with? You want to start with Herbert? I mean, not Herbert, with Lawrence is cheaper than I was really registering, 6,700. You want to start with Lawrence or Mahomes or Goff or Geno?
I'd like to start with Lawrence here.
All right. I like that, because he's in this. We talked about this with defenses, how you kind of start from the bottom up. Most people start from the bottom up and they hit that like 2,800 defense that looks really attractive, and then they just stop going up. And there might be a defense that's 3,100 that's even more attractive. I think you can do that with Goff this week and Geno this week. Not to say that they can't outscore Lawrence, but it would be easy to stop at Goff and be like, oh man, I'm saving at quarterback. And then it's like Trevor Lawrence is just a few hundred more than him and has a higher ceiling. So I like that starting point. Couple ways we could do this next. I mean, last week, what did Evan Ingram score last week? But last week, Travis Etienne had a pretty solid game for what's become a thin position. Zay Jones had a great game. Calvin Ridley had a great game. So pairing Lawrence with 2 guys here isn't a poor call, especially because what we're trying to do is win a tournament. And so if we're wrong on the game environment, then we're wrong on this roster, but like, the likeliest way for Trevor Lawrence to be the tournament winner is for 2 of his guys to hit. And I think we can even go Etienne and a pass catcher if we wanted, just because the Jags could score 5 touchdowns and Etienne gets 2, Lawrence throws for 3. You get the pass catcher who scores 2. I mean, Christian Kirk is interesting to me this week because he has the same role as Zay Jones, right? He's going to have some blow up games and nobody's going to want to play him after, I think it was a 3 target game last week. So Christian Kirk is interesting to me. Calvin Ridley is still very interesting to me. Zay Jones always interesting. Ingram's interesting. I'd throw 2 on myself on most of my Lawrence rosters, but I'll have some skinny stacks. So we can go either way here on this one.
I'd like to grab Christian Kirk here for the second guy to pair up with Lawrence.
Yeah, this is a really unique build. And what makes it interesting even more is we probably... Well, let me think about that. I was going to say we probably have to have Kelsey. That's the way most people are going to think, though. I was going to say we probably have to have Kelsey, and then that really restricts our salary, right? And so then that makes some of our choices for us, and we kind of start getting some buttons pushed for us. But we don't necessarily have to have Kelsey. And what I mean by that is there's a positional value of like Kelsey doesn't have to hit 4x because he's at tight end. And so if he scores 20 and all the other tight ends score 8 to 10, that's still a big edge. But also, if he scores 20, we can probably spend that salary better elsewhere. And this could be a shootout with Kelsey scoring 20 points, and then they spread the ball around to all these other guys. And maybe it would be a super unique roster to have Trevor Lawrence, Travis Etienne, Christian Kirk, and no Kansas City Chiefs players on the roster. And most people who look at the roster wouldn't understand that, but we can actually tell the story of the Jags winning 38-28, scoring 5 touchdowns, or 38-27, right? Kansas City scores 3 touchdowns, and Kelsey doesn't hit at his price tag, and none of these cheaper guys end up hitting. So yeah, I could actually go either way there. We could throw in Kirk and then decide if we want to do a bring back. And with the bring back, we could try to guess on Kadarius Toney or Sky Moore or one of these guys. I will say, like, Andy Reid talked this week about like drops are not an issue for Kadarius Toney. He has great hands. That's one of his features. And they need him to be part of this offense. So it wouldn't surprise me if they proactively try to get him going in this game just to like boost his confidence. But I'm also fine not playing Kadarius Toney. Like, I'll have a little bit of him this week, but not a ton.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking the same thing the second you said that Andy Reid said something about his drops and how he doesn't. It's not a problem. I was like, well, they're probably going to pass to him to boost the confidence because the entire internet is killing that right now.
Yeah, and Mahomes, Mahomes was talking about he's a guy that we need, and like we're going to rely on him. And obviously, like, you're going to say those things to boost the player's confidence, but it does boost the player's confidence more if you then come out the next game and you're like, let's scheme up some looks for this guy. And I mean, hard to see him catching more than like 4 or 5 passes, but he's relatively inexpensive. He'll be low owned, and on 4 or 5 passes, he can go for 75 yards and 2 touchdowns. Like, he has that in his range of outcomes. So yeah, people aren't going to be on Christian Kirk. People aren't going to be on Kadarius Toney. We get exposure to this popular game with some of the cheaper players in it who are capable of outperforming their salary. In terms of what could win us a tournament, this is definitely an interesting setup this week. Another note, just for people to keep in mind, Andy Reid also talked about what a great feel Rashee Rice has for space in a zone defense, and that they need to create more concepts to leverage Rashee Rice's ability to find those spaces in the zone. So he's another guy who, it's going to be hard to predict these Kansas City pass catchers, but in terms of just like taking shots on them and recognizing that some of them might hit on some of these weeks, you might need them. He's a guy who's interesting to me in large field play. All right, so where do you want to go next on this roster? We got kind of all of our options open in terms of position, games, what we want to do next year.
I kind of want to look at defense just so we can get a nice like base on what our salary is.
Cool. A couple that stand out to me: the Jets at 2,700, obviously on the road, but we saw how hard it was for Josh Allen and the Bills against the Jets. This is a phenomenal defense, and the one major concern is Zach Wilson could give Dallas a lot of short fields, and Dallas scores points that take away from the Jets defense just from that. But at 2,700, I think they are attractive. And then if we wanted to pay up, the Cowboys are obviously in a great spot. Will be more popular than a typical 4K defense, but they're going against Zach Wilson at home. The Jets are implied to score only 14 points. So not a lot of faith in Zach Wilson out there.
Do you think the Cowboys defense is going to be popular because of how many points they scored last time?
Yeah, to an extent. And, it's going to be a weird balance because nobody wants to pay 4K for defense. So I do think that as you get deeper into the week, everyone's scared of looking like a fish. Nobody wants their roster to be the roster that people are looking at and they're like, what a dumb play, So like there is going to be that back, and I can identify this because it goes on in my own head, right? And it probably goes on in your head where you're like, oh yeah, the Cowboys should do well. And then you're like, yeah, but they scored a bunch of points last week. And then it's like, and they're 4K. So everyone will be thinking about them, but I do think that a lot of people will kind of talk themselves off of them. So they'll be popular, but not like Washington defense popular, because people don't want to pay that much for defense. And, there was a lot of talk from the Cowboys this offseason about wanting to be the greatest defense of all time, like for this year, for them to be one of those legendary defenses. So not to say that just because they had one legendary game, that they are that, but that does their talent is at the top of the league. Them and the 49ers, right behind them, the Jets, honestly, but them and the 49ers are the defenses that are most feared in the league. So it's a sharp play, even if they put up 6 points last week. They might honestly be more popular if they put up 6 points last week, because then people wouldn't be like, they wouldn't have that extra thing to talk themselves off of like, well, I'm just kind of chasing the points from last week.
So one thing we talked about actually last week as well was the Texans defense and how we looked at the game log, and they had not gone negative once last year.
Yeah.
Think about the Texans against the Colts.
And it was almost all like 6 points, 7 points, 8 points. You know what's funny? My Puka Nacua roster, it was Nacua and the Texans defense and David Njoku. And I made one switch from Puka to Marvin Mims. And then I made a variation off that where I was like, I'm not playing the Texans defense in my high dollar. And so I moved from Njoku down to Isaiah Likely and from the Texans defense up to the Seahawks. So I lost 30 points in all from those 3 switches. But yeah, I had plenty of Texans defenses last week, just not in the place where it mattered most. Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting spot. Like Anthony Richardson, the Colts are going to keep the ball on the ground, and it's not likely that the Texans jump out to a big lead and force a bunch of passes through the air. So that limits opportunities for sacks, for turnovers, but also Anthony Richardson is probably going to make 1 to 2 mistakes per game. I think that the Texans are a little pricey for their likeliest range of outcomes, because their likeliest range is kind of another one of these 7 to 9 point games, but they probably get that. Like, they're not going to hurt you. And I think they'll be low owned because they're only 400 less than the Cowboys. So no, I don't mind that play. We're taking probably we have fewer paths to upside than spending a little bit more for the Cowboys, but the Texans are definitely in play for me this week.
Okay. Yeah. I was just wanting to pick your brain on that and see what your opinion was.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I guess we can pencil in the Cowboys right now, and then that gives us a sense of our salary for the rest of the roster. But there's a lot of flexibility to move down from our 4K defense. I think especially for hand builders, if you're doing MME, you can just be like, okay, I want 20% Cowboys defense, and you're going to force that into your builds. But if you're hand building everything, there can be that tendency to be like, yeah, I want some Cowboys defense. And then on every single roster where you have them, it's like, I could free up some salary and do this somewhere else, right? You end up with no Cowboys defense. So I think if you're hand building, it's important to be cognizant of that. And not to say that the Cowboys will be the defense you had to have even, right? Maybe they disappoint and score like 9 points, but just to say that they could score 15, 18, 20 points. And if you think of a 4K wide receiver who scores 20 points, like what that does for your roster. So you got to just keep it in mind and be willing to leave it on some builds. But yeah, we do have flexibility. It's our first build of the week to move off of them as well. And if we go cheap at tight end, we're not going Kelsey. So to me, strategically, it almost compels us to go cheap at tight end, unless we're going like Evan Ingram and building it into this game stack, which we're not. It almost compels us to go cheap at tight end, because another like Mark Andrews in his game environment against the Bengals is probably not going to put up like a score that separates from all the Kelsey rosters. So what we really want is to find that like 12 to 15 pointer at the cheap end, and maybe Kelsey scores 20 at a high price and we score 15 at a low price, and really close the gap on those Kelsey rosters.
Okay, cool. Is there anybody like in particular that you are interested in on the cheaper end?
So on a week like this, where there's a lot of offenses that I expect to score touchdowns, I want to get a lot of my practice builds so far just have like lots of Buffalo pieces, Detroit pieces, Seattle pieces, Jacksonville pieces, Kansas City pieces, because again, upside and look through tournament winning rosters, they always have touchdowns throughout those rosters. And in fact, DraftKings sets up pricing on the average player, the typical player. They're going to hit 4x their salary if they score 1 touchdown, and they're going to score more than 4x their salary if they score 2 touchdowns. So obviously they can have an outlier game in terms of production, but a typical production range, they need the touchdowns to really be those valuable pieces on your roster. So games where more touchdowns are scored increase the likelihood of one player scoring multiple touchdowns. So with that, I've had a lot of Dalton Kincaid and Dawson Knox on my roster so far. Dawson Knox, 3,100, Dalton Kincaid, 3,300. Kincaid's basically their number 3 wide receiver. And Gabe Davis might not truly be their number two. Kincaid might be their number two. I think it was 5 targets this last week. Knox had 4 targets. Since they're using Kincaid in more of a wide receiver role, they're able to keep Knox and Kincaid on the field at the same time. So Knox still has a role. Kincaid has more upside. I also like Luke Musgrave. You know, I don't know if you saw the play this last week where he was wide open down the sideline and like caught the ball and fell down. But there was a Jordan Love mishandled the snap. He like dribbled the football back into his hand. And then Luke Musgrave was wide open, caught the ball, had a cramp and fell down like close to the end zone. So the whole thing had the look of a busted play. But in reality, it was like he was that wide open because of the play design, and it was a play designed to go to him. So that stood out to me in terms of here's a rookie tight end in his first game, and they have plays drawn up to get him wide open downfield, and they're calling those plays in these games. So Luke Musgrave, no Christian Watson again this week, almost certainly. So Luke Musgrave, another guy who is interesting to me down here.
That's actually like the only time that I've been looking at like on the cheaper side this week. Again, I haven't like looked at the slate that much, but this is like I didn't even consider Kincaid or Knox, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean that game, just the touchdowns that are going to be scored. If I'm not getting, and I'll also, this is interesting. This I would like, if you're listening to this, write it down so you don't forget it. This will be, if you're a subscriber, this will be in the player grid this week. But all 4 times last year when Gabe Davis had a score that was like satisfying to excellent, anywhere in that range, all 4 times that he hit, Stephon Diggs also hit, and Josh Allen also hit. In other words, Gabe Davis hit in games where the Bills were just scoring a lot of points, right? So if you play Gabe Davis solo, it's almost pointless, because if you're getting Gabe Davis right, you're probably getting Stephon Diggs right as well, Josh Allen right as well. So you want to take advantage of that. So yeah, since I'm not going to play like Gabe Davis solo, and I'll probably play Josh, like, you know, maybe like some Steph Diggs and Jared Goff, like a cheaper quarterback. But for the most part, if I'm playing Diggs, I'm going to play Josh Allen. So I'm not going to have a lot of one-offs of the other pieces on the Bills. So I want to get some James Cook, Dalton Kincaid, Dawson Knox on my other rosters, just to have exposure to that offense.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, that being said, let's I'm cool with going Kincaid.
Cool. And that's going to free up our salary quite a bit now too, where we've got 6,400. Running back is an interesting position this week because we've got like, there's very few workhorse backs left in the NFL. So like the guys you're paying $7,000 for the most part are actually just guys who are getting the same workload as the cheaper guys, and you're just betting on them having a really good game. You know, like Bijan Robinson put up, you know, a solid game last week, but he's not always going to have as limited touches as he had, but he had like 11 touches or something like that. And there's going to be, 10 attempts, 6 receptions, so 16 touches, but the 10 carries, those receptions aren't always going to be there because Atlanta's not a team that passes the ball a ton. Saquon Barkley never topped like 25 points on DraftKings last season. And so you're basically, you're paying $8,000 for a guy who you're like, hopefully he has the best game he's had in this offense, you know, like, so I feel like a lot of these more expensive guys, the name value is there, but the upside isn't that much different from, or their chance of hitting the upside aren't that much higher than the cheaper guys. They're better running backs. They're going to do it a little bit more often, but the workload is kind of the same. So yeah, a lot of these more expensive, obviously Christian McCaffrey, very much in play. Austin Eckler is going to get a lot of pass game work, but it's going to be tough for him to have a monster game against that Tennessee run defense. He probably has one of his like 22 to 24 pointers. So, and then Tony Pollard taking on the tough Jets defense. So yeah, I don't mind going down to kind of these less expensive guys. There's opportunity to get exposure to the Lions offense through Jahmyr Gibbs or David Montgomery. There's opportunity to get exposure to the Seattle offense through Kenneth Walker, and just say, you know, if there's a bunch of touchdowns scored, maybe Walker gets involved in that. There's your dad's guy, Cam Akers, down there. For I don't want to go in that direction. Yeah. So any thoughts on what you want to do at running back on this roster?
Okay. What do you think about Tyler Algier?
Yeah, Tyler Algier is interesting, right? Because it is a split backfield. So like his touches are going to be limited. It's not like he's going to have a game where he's suddenly seeing 25 touches because Bijan Robinson is going to cut into that workload. But he's certainly capable. I mean, let's see how many carries he had this last week. It was 15 attempts. Obviously, he scored the 2 touchdowns, 15 attempts, 3 catches. I would think he's typically going to be in the 15 touch range. And then obviously, if there were a game in which the Packers jumped out to a lead, the Falcons aren't able to run as much as they want, then Algiers' touches go down even more. But he can certainly hit, right? If we're talking about who can win you a tournament, he can hit. Dameon Pierce, I actually wasn't thinking about him early in the week. And then as I was doing my DFS interpretations, Dameon Pierce started standing out as a guy who's going to see 20 plus touches in a soft matchup, or a relatively soft matchup. So yeah, any of these guys, like I'm not going to argue against any of these guys who can get, 15 to 20 touches down here in this range. AJ Dillon, Aaron Jones will probably be out. I don't love AJ Dillon as a player, but there's opportunity there for him to hit. James Conner gets all these touches on a bad team, but those touches can eventually matter. He had a lot of like 18 to 22 pointers last season, and that's going to happen again throughout this year. And Jahmyr Gibbs, honestly, he could have a 15 touch game and score 30 points. So any of these running backs are in play, and I don't really have like a strong case against any of them.
Cool. Let's go a little bit cheaper so we can see what we can get upside on wide receiver wise. Let's go.
Zach Moss is going to be starting for the Colts this week. He's back healthy and he's 4,700. He's not going to catch a lot of passes, but he's going to get 15 to 18 touches. And if he scores the touchdown, like if we really want to just say this is a thin position, let's see what we can get at wide receiver. That opens up a lot for us.
Sweet. I love that. Okay, cool.
Yeah. Now we've got, it's interesting because other people would look to save at defense to kind of free up that extra salary for wide receiver. We've saved at running back, which fewer people are going to do, which allows us to still have the Cowboys on a defense with excellent wide receiver pieces. So yeah, we could go like a Steph Diggs, Jerry Jeudy type route, or we could go down in price and go like Amon-Ra St. Brown, and we'd have to save a little bit more than we're 100 off for getting Amon-Ra St. Brown and DK Metcalf, which would be a really interesting pairing.
Yeah, cool.
But we could kind of play around with this roster. I mean, we could go from Dalton Kincaid down to Dawson Knox. We save 200, and that actually gives us a roster that tells a comprehensive story that makes a lot of sense. Let's go ahead and do that, because I actually really like what we can talk about here with this as well, which is in this spot, then we're betting on the Lions scoring points, which forces Seattle to get aggressive. But then we also recognize we don't need Geno or Jared Goff in that bet because Trevor Lawrence isn't much more expensive than them, right? And so we can actually place both bets at once. We can say both these games shoot out, but Trevor Lawrence is more mobile. He's going to get more rushing yards. He's probably going to pass for more yards, more opportunities for touchdowns. And so we kind of get this like 1-2 punch where it's like we're betting on Kansas City and Jacksonville going off, and people might not realize it, but if DK Metcalf's going to hit, it has to be in a game where Detroit's going off and Seattle's being forced to be aggressive. So like we're betting on Detroit, Seattle going off. And if both of those games go off, we're so well covered here. And then all of a sudden we've got Cowboys defense that a lot of people won't be able to find the way to pay up for, especially with this much upside on the roster. And then we've got Dawson Knox hopefully soaking up touchdowns on a Bills team that can score 4 or 5 touchdowns this week. And kind of wrap it up with like 1 week piece in Zach Moss, but he's capable of scoring 20 points and he unlocks a lot on this roster. And, we can go through it. Trevor Lawrence plus Travis Etienne plus Christian Kirk could go for 90 points. Kadarius Toney probably can't score 30, but he can score 20. Zach Moss can't score 30, but he can score 20. DK Metcalf can score 40. Amon-Ra St. Brown can score 35 to 40. Dawson Knox can score 18 to 20. The Cowboys defense can score 20 to 30. So like, what we want on tournament rosters is we don't want too much weight on one player. We don't want like, okay, I'm taking these 3K guys that might get 10 points, and that frees me up to get these high upside expensive guys, right? It's like, well, if one of those high upside expensive guys doesn't have his monster game, that roster can't get first place. What we want is those rosters where every spot we're like, and this guy can hit for a big game, and this guy can hit for a big game, this guy can hit for a big game, and that's what puts us in the best position to win tournaments. So yeah, this is a really cool roster. We have 4 players from Kansas City, Jacksonville, 2 players from Detroit, Seattle, and then we fill it in with nice pieces, like sharp pieces from there that can significantly outperform their salary in Zach Moss, Dawson Knox, and the Cowboys defense. You got any other thoughts on this before we close this out?
Yeah, I mean that, and the fact that it's just so different. Because I mean, you got to think we also don't even have. I'm running a blank. Tight end, Kansas City, Kelsey.
Kelsey. Yeah. And what's for even more cool about it that if you're a newer DFS player, this isn't something that you're used to thinking about, but it's pretty critical in tournaments. And that is if Christian Kirk, like we know Christian Kirk's not going to be popular because he had 3 targets last week. So if he's helping us win a tournament, there are going to be popular players on the Jags that he's taking points away from. So all the people who are rostering Calvin Ridley, they're probably not getting the ceiling game from Calvin Ridley because those points are going to Kirk instead. Everybody who's rostering Zay Jones, they're not getting the ceiling game from Zay Jones because those points are going to Christian Kirk instead. So in other words, if we get our Christian Kirk bet correct, we're not just helping our own roster, but we're hurting a lot of other rosters around us, which significantly increases our chance of a first place finish. And a lot of times people think of low owned players in a vacuum. They're like, oh, this guy's low owned. So if he hits, that's great for me. And it is, but that's going to win you a tournament far less often than low owned players who are taking away points from high owned players. And then same thing with Kadarius Toney. People will be betting on Travis Kelce. If Toney has a ceiling game, then that takes away points from Travis Kelce and hurts those rosters. So it's like other rosters are going down and we're going up at the same time, which is how we win tournaments, is kind of continuing to shed the rosters we're competing against on our way up. And then probably a popular pairing in Amon-Ra and Metcalf, but not everybody's going to have that paired with Kansas City, Jacksonville, and nobody's going to have it paired with our bet on Kansas City, Jacksonville. So we don't really have to worry about the ownership there. It's just a sharp play, grab the upside there. So really sharp roster, especially for a Thursday build in terms of a lot of times our Thursday builds, we finish them and it's like, yeah, and we could push around these pieces and we could still do these things. But this is one that like this would be ready to go in a tournament, wouldn't need any changes in terms of thinking through, okay, well, maybe this is a better way to play. Maybe this is a better way to play. It's just a sharp build all the way around. With that, we are going to get out of here. We will see you on Saturday. I don't know, Keegan, if you and I are recording tomorrow or Saturday, but I don't even know if I filled you in on this. We got a FanDuel show on a FanDuel DFS lab that Mike and I forget who it is are doing on Fridays, but we'll have our Saturday show that we'll record tomorrow or Saturday. So with that, we will see you guys back here on Saturday. We'll see you on 1 week season throughout the weekend, and we will see you at the top of the leaderboards in week 2.